Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. I'm JL, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Stephan Lee, who calls himself a young adult literature enthusiast and an ardent K-pop fan. Of course, he's not just a fan, he's also a journalist who writes about K-pop and other subjects. Stephan covered books and movies for Entertainment Weekly for many years and currently serves as a senior editor at Bustle. And he has also written a book. The New York Times has declared his debut YA novel, Kpop Confidential, to be the delectable K-pop confessional we've all been waiting for. So welcome to the Korea Society, Stephan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, Jay, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to speak to an organization all about Korean culture.
Absolutely, you are in the right place. A quick reminder to our viewers, you can send your questions to Stephan via Twitter at Korea Society Art or email artsandculture@koreasociety.org. So first of all, congratulations on your first book. That is very, very exciting.
Thank you.
So how did this happen? Did you always want to write about K-pop or a YA novel or some sort of a combination of the two?
Well, it really happened very fortuitously because I had been working on a novel for basically 10 years, like almost all of my adult life. A different one, completely different. And it was an adult novel, but it was set in a high school. And I'd been working on it for so long and I felt like, oh, I'm getting kind of close to finished with it, but I still have a long way to go. And I was getting a little burnt out on it. But suddenly I got an email from David Levithan, who's an well-known young adult author, but he's also the publisher of Scholastic. And he asked me, do you have any ideas for a K-pop YA novel? And honestly, I hadn't really thought about it for myself because I'd been so focused on this other book. But I had always thought someone should write a K-pop YA novel, especially about the trainee process, because I just thought that would lend itself really perfectly to young adult literature. So when he asked me, I was like, maybe I can kind of put this other book aside just for a bit because I needed a kind of a break from it. And I thought about ideas for what eventually became Kpop Confidential. And I just wrote a proposal over the weekend and Scholastic loved it. And they're like, great, can you write it in 3 months? So that's kind of the beginning of the book for me.
Great. Well, I find it really interesting that it's actually the publisher who had the idea of having K-pop as a subject for a YA novel. And I guess that just shows how popular K-pop is and that even an American publishing company would be interested in that subject. Right. Were you surprised when you were approached about this project?
I was and I wasn't. It's interesting. I swear I had this weird sense that someone would ask me. I have no idea why. I had no reason to think that, but it was just so in the zeitgeist. And I knew that if someone asked me, I would be kind of pretty well prepared, just because of my background. But I really, weirdly, when I got the email, I almost felt like, ooh, I was waiting for this. But it's interesting because yes, Scholastic did have an idea to do a K-pop YA novel, and they actually had like a couple of ideas, for a concept. But when they told me those, I was like, it's a good thing you came to me because they were very much written by like non-Koreans, and it just had all sorts of crazy things. It had like a girl group and a boy group, and their companies make them date each other for publicity. And I was like, no, that doesn't happen.
Oh, no, that would never happen. No.
So I was like, okay, you needed me. So I came up with a completely different idea.
So then tell us about your book. And
Yes.
Candace Park, I think she's one of the most likable heroines that I have seen in a long time. She's so cute, actually, and so spirited, she's a great character. So tell us a little bit about your book.
Sure. So the book, Kpop Confidential, it's such a cool cover, as you'll see. It starts off with Candace Park, who lives in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and she is really the kind of typical obedient Korean American daughter. She takes all the AP classes and she plays the viola because her parents make her. And she plays the viola, not the violin, because the viola has fewer people who play it. So the parents think, oh, you'll get into really nice, like, prestigious orchestras easier. But she's not even good at it because she hates it so much. But she's always been a good singer, but it's just not a talent that's been valued by her parents. So she's never been brave enough to pursue it for herself. But then her best friends, who are not Korean, but are huge K-pop fans and actually much bigger K-pop fans than she is at first, convince her to go audition for SAY Entertainment, which is the K-pop company behind the biggest group in the whole world named SLK. And they're looking for their first ever girl group. So she goes to the audition in New Jersey and she passes. So now she's able to train as a trainee for this group in Seoul. So she has to convince her parents to let her go, which is a big uphill climb because they are not the types of parents who would, but she manages to convince them. And she enters this trainee program and she realizes it's way, way harder than she ever expected. She makes friends, she makes rivalries. The rehearsal schedules are insane. The diets are very restrictive, and that's all based on research. And she has to kind of navigate this whole world as a foreigner. Even though she is Korean American, she's very foreign within this company. And she also has to decide whether or not she really wants to be chosen. She has to weigh like her dreams against whether or not she can authentically achieve her dream on her own terms within this company. So that's pretty much the novel.
Yeah, and there's so many things we can talk about. And first of all, I want to say I loved how Candace convinced her parents. Basically, she tells them it's gonna make great material for a college essays. Because obviously that was their concern. Like, why are you going to Korea for 2 months and not study? And I do want to point out that this is a book. Yeah, this book is a fiction. It's not an expose, but you did do so much research. You must have, because it just seems so real, like all the details that you put in there. And the bulk of the book is about Candice going through this so-called trainee program in Korea. As successful and popular as they are, I think there is this preconceived notion about K-pop groups that they are sort of manufactured in the United States. And I think that notion actually comes from this very particular way of one becoming a pop star, which sounds very different from what Americans or Europeans are normally used to. And that is through this sort of going through a trainee program that is sort of sponsored or led by the talent, basically the music talent groups that are putting all the bills and making sure that this actually happens so they can release the record and so forth. So let's talk about this trainee system, because your book does spend a lot of it is basically about Candice training to become a K-pop star. So first of all, who did you talk to and how do you do research about the programs like this? Were the K-pop music groups open to you and telling you about all the secrets that they have of how to turn an ordinary teenager into a K-pop star?
So this was really, really tricky because, a lot of idols don't really like talking about the trainees system, or they're probably kind of not allowed to. And, of course, the companies are not really going to share exactly either. And, there are always so many like NDAs and contracts that make it really hard to talk about this. So I definitely looked at a lot of like documentaries and articles that were written by Western media, just to see from the outside. And those definitely have a certain tone about like, oh, like this is so cool. You know, they have the tone of being like, this is really different and like kind of negative because, you know, it's so different from the American system. But I also, you know, watched a lot of accounts on YouTube of people who had been through the system. And I also have a friend who went through the trainee program at one of the big, well, now it's a big four, but one of the big three previously, K-pop companies. And I can't say which company or who they are.
Oh, come on.
I know. You'd get in a lot of trouble, but like, they actually gave me a lot of really, really good information. But at the same time, because like, you know, you can research all day, but there's ways that you still couldn't make it feel real, even if you get all the facts right. So I had to use a lot of my imagination to kind of think about like, how would, you know, a person feel when they're in this situation? Like, what do they think about at night? Or like, you know, what goes through their head all the time? Or what's like a weird, you know, superstition that a lot of the idols have. So like a lot of those things, I just put myself in their shoes and I came up with a lot of things. And it's funny because I made up a lot of things, you know, because I'm primarily a fiction writer and writer than like just a K-pop expert. And it's funny because my friend who's been through the system, when they read the book or an early draft, they were like, wait, I didn't tell you about this. And I was like, oh, no one told me about this. I made this up. And they're like, oh, well, like this really did happen. And like, no one would ever know that it would. Like things like, I have this like detail in the book called the gender glass.
Yes.
And I completely made that up, but like my my trainee friend was like, no, like that is exactly the way they thought. So after a while, once you're really in the characters, I think you kind of end up like just understanding the world so well that even things that you make up are actually real.
And what also you write so well is this idea of training, because they do. Candice only goes through this for a few months, but it is also true that we've heard of all these people who go through this training for years after years. Some of them, you know, they may attend, you know, schools, but a lot of them, it is basically almost like a boarding school type of thing. You know, you are dedicated to become a pop star, you know, a K-pop star, and therefore you spend, you know, hours and days and years just dedicated to this idea of training. So can you tell us a little bit about what you know about this training program? Like, how young are they sometimes when they start training? I mean, we've heard all these stories about, you know, now the, you know, famous K-pop stars, but when do they usually start? Candice, by the way, in the book, she's 15. So that is a young age. She's a teenager. But for those teenagers to go through this really rigorous programs, it's an incredible dedication when you think about it. So can you tell us a little bit about the training programs?
So there are idol academies like outside of the K-pop companies and official training facilities that you know, a lot of kids enter really, really young. But yeah, individuals get kind of on these companies' radars from a very early age, like sometimes 10 or 11. And obviously, if they're training at that age, they're going to school and living with their family. But then training after school and in the morning or just whenever they have time, all the time. Candice is able to be a live-in trainee where she actually lives at the company because it's the summer for her, but also everyone else at the company is a bit older than her, like, you know, past school age, past high school age. So they're also able to put 100% of their time into it. And I think it's interesting. A lot of people assume that debut K-pop stars are all really, really young, but a lot of them are at least like 20 and 21, and that's become more of the norm. And yeah, and at that point, they're able to put all their time into it. But it's really common for a lot of these K-pop idols to have trained for 10 or even more years by the time they debut. So by that point, they're very, very ready. And it's also psychologically so stressful for these people because they could be, you know, sacrificing all of their extra time. They're not, you know, focusing as much on school maybe than they would have if it weren't for this dream. But the odds are still so small to actually make it. So a majority of trainees give up so much of their childhoods, but then don't ever get to debut. So it's a lot of stress, and it's funny, and this is what I try to really highlight in the book, that Candace coming in so late is not that easy for the other trainees to accept. They're like, how is she coming in right at the end when they're about to choose when we've been here for 10 years? So I really tried to capture how I would feel in that situation. So it is a very cutthroat environment, but there are also it's still really fun at the same time.
Also reading about those trainings, then you also kind of go, well, that's why they are so good. I mean, I'm not so sure about the singing part, but the dancing part, the perfectly,
Yes.
K-pop has this reputation for that perfect choreography where, any number of them can just, dance in sync, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And there is actually a line where Candice also realizes what all that training meant, right? Because
Right.
it's just been so drilled into them that it just comes very naturally.
Yeah.
When they have to perform, she doesn't even have to think about it.
Yes. And if things go wrong, you can kind of lean back on your training. Right.
Yeah. So there's a line that says skills never fail you. And it kind of reminded me also like that whole idea of repeating and just working really hard. I tend to think that a lot of what happens, how certain cultural products happen, sort of reflect what's going on in the society already.
Right. Yeah.
And it seems like this ethos of working really hard and, repeating something, it reminded me of like how actually a lot of teenagers are told what to do at school, even,
Right.
even when they are not K-pop,
Right.
trainees, they're supposed to memorize and, they go to cram schools. So do you think, I mean, this very particular Korean institution that is K-pop trainee, do you think it's kind of reflecting of the culture, sort of cultural norm? I don't know if that's the
Absolutely.
right word, of Korea. Yeah.
Yes, I really think that. I think that it seems like in Korean culture at large, long hours and really, really hard work are kind of the bare minimum, to not just get ahead, but to keep up. And of course, that's extremely stressful. And I think a lot of times people in the West think a bit negatively about that just because it's so different. And I think in the West, the value is more on, well, what's your passion? Shouldn't you be focusing on what your passion is? But I don't think it's better or worse the way that, Koreans do it. Because the thing about something like K-pop, for instance, or even school or anything, is people can drill you up until a point. But at a certain point, like, no matter how much someone tells you to do something, it's not really going to sink in unless you really have that desire as well. So I think that's what people find with like the K-pop stars who really make it, that they actually love it. They might not love every part of it, and it wasn't easy, and they probably wanted to quit sometimes, but to stick to it, I think having it be so difficult is like a kind of test, is if like, oh, you can really handle this, or you want this. And that goes the same with like how competitive school is in Korea too. Like, I think you have to put in those hours, but if it's really something that you love, then it might really actually stick with you. So I think there's definitely really negative aspects or positive aspects to like kind of the extreme drilling. method of learning or acquiring new skills, but also I think that like just following passion is sometimes not enough too, and like sometimes like without that discipline you just never find it. So yeah, I think there's positive and negative to both, philosophies.
Obviously, yeah. But then also, you do not shy away from what, again, a lot of people who are outside of Korea, when they look into the K-pop industry, they always talk about the diet, the look.
Hmm.
It, Candice is asked to actually have, plastic surgery, which,
Hmm.
we'll let the readers find out what she does. And the incredible makeup and sort of the makeover they go through.
Hmm.
Obviously, it's also a reflection of another very, popular sort of culture export from Korea, the K-beauty part.
Hmm.
That's one of the reasons why they become so famous. But I don't think this emphasis, especially because your book is also about a young woman,
Hmm.
and they are in it. I do not think that all this emphasis on the look and looking certain way is not necessarily a Korean
Right,
thing. It happens everywhere and
right,
anywhere. But why do you think that there seems to be such a focus on that when people talk about K-pop,
right.
especially girl groups?
I think part of it is like, I do think that K-pop does a really good job of projecting perfection, even more than Hollywood. Like these videos are so slick and everybody looks so like, unnaturally perfect. So I think a lot of people are fascinated by it. But I also think that like, you know, um, makeup goes a long way and also like filtering goes a long way. And I don't think Korean stars like think that they're tricking anybody. I think it's just like, oh yeah, like everybody knows that like these are heavily filtered, but like it is just kind of about presentation and how other people experience you. um and I think a lot is made of it because I also think that like the kind of racist element of it is that I think a lot of Westerners assume that Koreans all want to look like each other. But I think like a lot of Koreans, when seeing K-pop stars, are like, oh no, they don't really look that much alike. So I think that's just kind of an outside. That's kind of like a slightly racist perspective sometimes when people assume that, oh, all Koreans want to look the same. Um, but yes, there obviously is like a huge emphasis on appearances. One thing that I found in my research is that these idol companies really will never force anyone to get plastic surgery. They might suggest it or offer it, but like, and often what I've been told is that the trainees or the idols really want it themselves, if certain things. So like it's really not, it's always like a choice. And yeah, but it is a big issue, but I wanted to make sure it wasn't just like presented as a Korean issue, because like if you look at Instagram and see a lot of influencers, they seem to want the same features as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I wanted to present it as like a human problem of like, what different cultures value as attractive. And obviously it's none of that is really real. If there were like certain features that were universally or like objectively attractive, then every culture would want that. But each culture has a different one. So it's really hard. It's really impossible to try to fit whatever your culture's image is if it's not natural to you. And I really wanted to examine all that pressure that's put on people. And I think in the West, there's more, the body positivity movement has gone a lot further than it has in Korea, but I think it's also changing in Korea too. And I think that's a positive thing for sure.
Yeah. And speaking of the cultural differences, one thing that weirdly stood out for me from your book, and you just mentioned it very casually once or twice, is modesty blanket.
Yes.
Because to me, it's so. First of all, can you explain to our viewers what a modesty blanket is?
Yes, I don't think that's what they're actually called.
But you call them, yes.
I call them that within the book. And you see this a lot on variety shows with young female stars. They wear extremely short shorts or skirts. And then when they sit down, they're often provided with a modesty blanket to cover themselves up. And Candace wonders about this because this is just another like cultural difference. But one time she shows up in the trainee dorm wearing like spaghetti straps, which are very normal for her, but like that's kind of scandalous to to the Korean people. Yet wearing very short things is not, and they just have to cover themselves up all the time. But I don't know. I was also fascinated by those little things too, because I see those on Korean TV, and I'm like, oh, what's that all about? And but I never really heard them like examined or anyone talk about them that much. So I just wanted to kind of get deeper with some of those like little quirks of Korean entertainment culture.
Yeah, because it is, I mean, there's definitely, certain appearance that you want, or a certain look that you want to project. So
Right.
that they could be very shorts or skirts, but it's almost like you can't be too sexy.
Right.
Like there's definitely that difference in Korea. Like even though you look at them, you think they are very revealing, but in a weird way, they are not really.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that they will be so concerned, like basically when I read about Modest Blanket, it's like, oh, there's no chance of wardrobe malfunction whatsoever,
Right.
right? I mean, that's basically what they are going for. So it's really interesting to think of like what they considered as acceptable sort of
Right.
sexiness or glamorousness or whatever that could be.
Yeah, it's kind of a metaphor for kind of the changing values
Yeah.
in Korea, I think, because I it's interesting how, for instance, look at Blackpink. Some of their concepts and their videos and their performances are so fierce. Yet, as soon as they're kind of off stage and they're talking to an interviewer, they're so polite, so modest. And it's almost like, oh, if you saw them just in their videos, you'd almost be a little scared of them. But then, and like, they even they don't say like really bad words, but they say, kind of like edgy words sometimes in their songs, but then they would never in a million years say that off stage. So I think that like it's interesting how Korean entertainment kind of contends with like kind of the values of like, entertainment globally, because I think saying edgy words or appearing hard or bold is kind of a norm in the world. And then to see how the Korean culture fits into that is interesting, because like you get compromises like modesty blankets, like wearing really stylish outfits, but then also kind of pulling it back a little bit too. And I find that really interesting. And I think Candace struggles with that in the book a little bit too, because like, oh, some of these lyrics are so, oh, look at me, I'm the best. But then they're absolutely not expected to act like that off stage. So
It's all about bowing to somebody and making sure that you're not worthy of the praise. Like you have to make sure that you have to make sure to appear as modest and humble as possible in when you're speaking to somebody.
exactly. And it seems like when, idols speak in public, there's only like a few things that are very acceptable to say, like, oh, we worked really hard, we'll continue to work hard. Please like expect big things from me. So like, yeah, it's just like it's interesting because I think that is kind of a push pull of like how to connect globally. But it's interesting that I don't think Korean K-pop stars have to change everything about Korean culture to appeal globally, which is I think what we're really discovering. Because I think foreign people love seeing that. I think they're like, wow, how respectful, how like humble. That's a really big change from what we're used to. And I think people love the Korean aspects of the culture.
Yeah, maybe that's part of the appeal too.
Hmm.
Um, and speaking of the Koreanness of it, you do realize how there's this idea that they represent Korea. The
Hmm.
K-pop idols sort of represent Korea to the world,
Hmm.
and they are sort of the one of the characters in the book actually said they are supposed to be a manifestation of the best this country can produce. I mean, that's a huge thing to ask for a little girl like Candace, but there is definitely that sense of um, they're not just you know they're not doing this for their own glory. Almost, it's
Hmm.
like this is like how we show ourselves to the world type of
Right.
idea behind it. Like have you found when you talk to the K-pop idols or other people
Mm.
in this business, is that really a sense when they're it's not just about making money, it's really
Mm.
about telling the world about Korea and trying to put the best foot front, basically, it seems like.
Yeah. I don't think that's always what the artists themselves are thinking, but I do think that like in terms of like the media or the companies, that is what they're thinking about. Because I think K-pop is kind of a amazing visualization of the progress Korea has made so quickly. Because, you know, relatively recently, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, but now it's obviously, you know, a big superpower. And culturally, you know, it's such a small country in terms of size, and also aren't that many natural resources to the land. So what can you really project outwards? And like, you know, they've become such leaders in technology, auto, so many other things. And then with culture, um, I think Korea really stands out among East Asia in that Koreans really want to share what they have been making with everyone else. And that's not necessarily a priority to a lot of other countries. And I think culture and entertainment is a huge and extremely powerful way to um, have influence in the world stage. And it's not just about money, because the Korean people are so proud of um, the country and the culture. And there's so many great reasons to be. I mean, I'm really proud of it too. And I've become more proud of it as I've gotten older, even as a Korean American. And I think K-pop does typify that. Like, I think that they have absorbed a lot of um, things that they learned from, you know, Western pop culture or pop culture globally, but have kind of done it better than anybody else in a way. And I think it's amazing how much like the goals that Korea has had, you know, to spread the language a bit more, or spread some of the values or even the food a bit more. And K-pop has been such an amazing way to do that and a tool for that. And I think that's also why a lot of the artists feel so much pressure.
And speaking of pressures that these artists
Yeah.
face, one of the concepts that I wasn't very familiar with that you mentioned a little bit in the book is the saseng fans.
Oh, yes.
And sort of, they're almost like stalker type of people who
Right.
makes life very difficult for certain people. And I wasn't even sure if that was a real thing or not, but especially because also Korea is so it's everybody talks about how it has one of the fastest internet connections, and everybody's
Yes.
everybody's online basically. And obviously phones are, everybody has the latest
Right.
phones from Samsung and LG and wherever. That this sort of Saseng fans, that sort of the combination of
Mm.
paparazzi and stalkers and diehard fans all rolled into one. It seems like,
Yeah.
is that really like a huge problem? I mean, in Korea, like have you heard any stories? And is
Yeah.
there anything that the management companies or the police or whoever is doing to actually like protect them, because it does sound scary, and it does sound like a not just a huge invasion of privacy, but it can get dangerous. So have you heard any other stories regarding that?
Yes, and I think basically any popular K-pop fan has to deal with this to a certain extent, but it's also notable that it's a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of fans who are this way. But even if you only have a few, if you are that star, it can become a huge problem in your life. And yes, so I put that into the novel because I wanted to, show the excitement, but also the danger of this world. And a lot of these like Sasang fans, they are obsessed with these stars, but they don't always wish the best. They almost just want to get noticed no matter what. So this is something that I do think that a lot of the artists have to deal with. And some of these Sasang, or not all of them deserve that name, but a lot of these like really, really hardcore fans sometimes get known nationally, like, oh, the whole fandom knows about this one,
Oh,
overly devoted fan. So like, sometimes the real fans, the regular fans will help the artists like manage that, the crazy activities of like a few fans, and like actually alert people, alert the companies. So yeah, it's a very, very small, tiny, tiny, tiny percentage, but if you are that person, it can be a big part of your life.
absolutely. It's a scary thought, but it also, I think, shows, whenever people talk about BTS's success, outside of Korea, they always talk about how they were able to connect with the fans, in their own terms and all that. And I think this concept of Sasang fans sort of like shows the flip side. It's always the things are double-edged sword, right? So it's the sort of the
Yes.
flip side of that. But also, what's interesting is at the end, Candice basically, she has to make the debut in the book. Like that's
Yes.
everybody's goal. Like you want to be part of the team, the new girl group
Yes.
that they are forming. And it's almost like those audition shows,
Hmm.
competition shows. And I think they're incredibly popular. I mean, obviously in the America, we used to have American Idol, we have The
Right.
Voice, all these shows too. What do you think the attraction of these audition shows are?
Right.
Obviously, there's that, so sort of the Star is Born
Hmm.
quality to it, when you didn't know anybody and then somebody comes out. But also, it not dehumanizing, but sometimes it just seems like eh, you can't really judge one person with one song or something like that,
Hmm.
one performance. But there is definitely that sort of the cutthroatness involved in
Yeah.
all these type of shows.
Right.
But we watch them. I mean, I'll
Yes.
confess, I watch them.
Yeah.
What do you think our attraction is to those type of shows, like watching people competing with each other and trying to be better than somebody? Is that
Right.
just human nature? But
I think it's human nature, and I think the brilliance of it is they bring so many different people together and pit them against each other for like, one spot or five spots or however many. And I think you always end up identifying with somebody who either is most like you, or who you want to be like, or who you want to be with, or, or whatever. So you put a lot of emotional investment in them. And because they start out as such regular people usually, it's really fun to see the transformation, because it's just like, ooh, could this happen to me? And I think also going back to what we were talking about, the trainee process, and how, whether a lot of these trainees are really talented and passionate about music when they start, but some of them, aren't really when they start, but then they are transformed. And I think that transformational aspect is just so alluring to people, because it's like, ooh, I feel like a very normal average person, but maybe, with the right training or the right professional help, I could become like, extraordinary. So I really think that's what the dream is. But like, as you said, there's always the double-edged sword. And that's really what the book is about, because what Candace realizes is that like she wants so badly to be seen for her talent and to be exceptional. But at the same time, I made sure to really put this in throughout the whole novel. There, she always realizes that it would be a relief if she got cut. You know, it would be actually be easier, obviously, to go home. And she fought so hard against her family to let her be there, but um, sh at every point, she's like, "Oh, if my mom literally pulled me onto the plane to take me back to America, I would just be I would be mad and I'd be like, oh, I could have been a big star, but you didn't let me." But she would also be very relieved that she has like now has an excuse for why she's not a big star anymore. But yeah, I think it is just like the fantasy, and you know, the reality is always different, I guess.
And then there's also another question you pose throughout the book is, and I think it's also, again, going back to sort of like the non-Koreans looking at the K-pop industry and sometimes make these quote unquote criticism or about the industry, saying they're just idols. They are, they are made. They are not true artists. So, this idea of, what you call idol versus artist.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit? I mean, because I think a lot of people don't realize that these K-pop stars are not just, they practiced a lot, but they are very talented people.
Right.
And just like any other artist, they are trying to express themselves. Maybe it's within certain framework, maybe it's within certain genre, but that's what they are trying to do. Yet, people seem to have this sort of, cliched idea of, if you are somebody who looks really cute and can dance very well, that's about it. It's not, you're not being a true artist.
Right.
And the Americans also have I guess everybody has this sort of what an artist should be.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about this, the sort of the discrepancy, should I say, between idol versus artist, and if you think that if there are K-pop artists who are sort of bridging that gap these days?
Yeah, no, I love that question. I think it has, well, first of all, people don't always realize this, but like K-pop doesn't mean Korean music industry. K-pop means like, usually people who come from certain companies, and who've been through the trainee process, like K-pop idols. But there are a lot of, independent Korean artists who exist outside of, the kind of machinery, and, and they do a lot of the same things that indie musicians anywhere do. But I wanted to really explore kind of like what a creative person might do just to get in the door, because so Candace is a songwriter, and that's, as well as a singer, and that's kind of her big X factor. And she's a really bad dancer, and dancing is a huge part of K-pop, obviously, and especially in a girl group. So there's this sense that, okay, all I have to do to get the platform to be able to be like a songwriter and really get to sing is I have to do all this other stuff first, because with even with K-pop groups where the members do a lot of their own songwriting and have a lot of creative control, they usually have to earn that over a long time, or they have to be successful with their first couple of albums in order to do that. And obviously so many K-pop stars are really, really like astoundingly talented people. BTS has started to write a lot of their own songs, and a lot of other groups end up being able to, have a lot of ownership over their own careers over time. But it's also kind of a analogy to other types of things, like for instance, like working really hard to get into the best college. There's this sense like, okay, I have to do all these things that I don't really want to do, and I don't think will actually have that much benefit for me. But once I do it, then I can have more freedom to do exactly what I want later. And that's kind of what Candace has to kind of balance with herself, because like there's a lot of things she doesn't want to do. There's a lot of things she doesn't agree with, but there's this sense that like, oh, maybe I can ignore this for a while until I have enough power to be able to say things and have people listen to them.
Yeah, there's definitely that. Also, Candice is a Korean American. And it's not unusual actually in K-pop, especially I think for girl groups or female groups, that you would have like one member who is Korean American or Korean Australian or Korean
Yes.
Canadian. Do you think they look for them because they speak English and that therefore it would appeal better to the non-Koreans? Or?
Yeah, I think part of the reason why the trainee process is so long is because they want these groups to be kind of like perfectly appealing. So there's usually a member who knows Chinese pretty well. There's usually like an English speaker. So yeah, I do think that it is generally pretty strategic. And I don't think that it's necessarily true that like American artists will only be American audiences will only be interested in a group if there's like an American on it, because, you know, like look at BTS, you know, they don't really have any who are American or Korean American. So, but yeah, like I do think it's good to have certain types of diversity in K-pop groups, and I think that's what they go for. But it was also one of the most fun parts of the book to write, is to show Candace being a foreigner, even in the country where her parents are from. I think that's an experience that every Korean American has had. I've definitely had a lot of that. And I've definitely put a lot of my own kind of experiences and thoughts into that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is a great way also, sort of the gateway for the readers, because she finds a lot of things, you know, unusual, or she doesn't quite comprehend. And so, you know, the non-Korean readers can learn as, you know, goes along with her and learns as she does. But also I wanted to ask you, since you grew up in the United States and you're Korean American, did you watch any Korean dramas or listen to Korean music as you were growing up? I mean, I know you're young, but you know, when you were growing up, you know, we didn't have BTS, we didn't have Blackpink.
No.
They weren't dominating sort of, you know, as they are now. So what was your sort of introduction to Korean pop culture when you were young?
So I'm pretty ashamed to say this now, but I did kind of make an effort not to pay attention to Korean entertainment when I was younger. And I think that's partly because the culture was different. I grew up in, you know, the 90s in Atlanta, Georgia, and my focus was really more on like, oh, how to fit into American culture more than embracing, you know, Korean culture. I think that's changed now. I think like I think Korean American kids generally think it's cool to like embrace, you know, their own selves. But like also it's also getting older. Like now I'm like, oh, like the things that make me or the things that make me different are really awesome. And now I'm really interested. But growing up, Korean entertainment always felt so different, and it was always through the lens of my parents. So, you know, like when I was growing up, like a very Korean area in Atlanta was called Buford Highway, and they would go to this like Korean video rental place and get like stacks and really tall stacks, and then just like sit in the basement and eat ojingo and watch shows. And I always thought, okay, that is like the least cool thing ever. It's a lot of you know, it seemed to be a lot of like families that live together, like, you know, older generations and, you know, kids and the parents all living in the same roof and like having a lot of drama and like crying a lot. Or like, you know, it seemed like the grandma would always be yelling like, oh, how did you lose your job? Why did you lose, you know, all that kind of thing. And so it was like it was not cool to me. But it's so funny because now, like, you know, K dramas are like all I want to watch. Like I'm like so like fixated on like Startup and all these other like cool like different types of shows. But yeah, that was my main exposure. And I don't know, I think I always compared it to American entertainment, and I always thought, oh, American entertainment's better. But it was only because that's what I knew better. And I was very obsessed with pop music when I was growing up. I loved like Britney Spears and Destiny's Child and all these groups. Um, but I just like didn't see much like anybody who was Korean and doing it in America. So it just like wasn't a possibility in my head. So now I'm so obsessed with like specifically K-pop groups. So it really just transferred very neatly. But yeah, it took a while. And I have to say, even when I started at Entertainment Weekly as an adult like journalist, um, some on the rare occasion that something Korean came up, um, I was always put on it, and I was always happy to do it, but I always kind of felt like a little bit of a fraud because I hadn't really learned it that well at that point. But it was kind of a slow progression to not only um, it was tied me like really appreciating Korean culture and entertainment was really tied to appreciating the Korean parts of myself. So yeah, that's been like a longer journey. I have to
Yeah.
say.
Which is also kind of reflected in the book a little bit, I
Mm-hmm.
guess. But also, as you mentioned, you are a journalist
Mm-hmm.
and you've been covering K-pop stars or Korean cultural exports
Mm-hmm.
for a while. And when you observe, and even though you could argue that maybe you weren't as fluent in it as you're now, but at
Mm-hmm.
least you had that background of you've had some exposure to the culture
Yes.
and you've had some familiarity with it. But then when you watch other sort of non-Korean entertainment journalists
Mm-hmm.
writing about
Yes.
K-pop, what they call the K-pop phenomena or whatever it is, do you think there is a different standard when they are looking at K-pop groups or Korean? Let's focus on K-pop groups because we are
Yeah.
talking about K-pop. Do you think there's a different standard they apply to the Korean K-pop groups, or do they know even how to approach that subject?
Right. So this is the interesting thing. There are a lot of, non-Korean K-pop journalists who know a lot more about like the facts, the ins and outs of different groups than I do. But what they don't really have is like the kind of like gut level understanding of like growing up Korean, or like kind of the parts of Korean culture that like are hard to put into words. You know what I mean? So I sometimes feel that when I'm reading pieces by non-Korean journalists, but I really I like that non-Korean journalists are interested. So I really celebrate that non-Korean journalists are so passionate and knowledgeable. Um, and I don't think a lot of people know this, but like a lot of times like K-pop fans kind of complain like about big outlets whenever they do a big cover story about a K-pop group or something. They're always like, "Oh, why didn't they hire a Korean American journalist to do it?" And I understand that, like I have that complaint too, but it's actually not always from the magazine. Sometimes like, the K-pop companies like kind of insist like, "Oh, we'd rather have like a someone who's not Korean American," just so like I think there's a perception that that feels more like a exchange, cultural exchange a bit more.
Or credibility or something that
I don't know.
what
Yeah, it's
yeah
really interesting. Like
it's interesting, yeah.
every Korean American journalist who covers like pop culture like has been like assigned a big K-pop interview by a big, American magazine. But then at the last minute, like there's like, oh, sorry, like they request, that's
Oh,
happened to all of us.
that's
Um,
interesting.
yes, but I think that is just like rooted in Korea's desire to share, with different cultures. And I have to say, like, I I love a lot of these non-Korean K-pop journalists. I think they have so much knowledge and so much appreciation of the culture, and a lot of them have at this point learned a lot of the language, and are, able to like, type in Hangul pretty well and everything. But
right?
I I did have a bad run-in, like, before my book came out. There were these two, I'll have to say, like, white K-pop journalists who just, like, picked apart, like, things about Korean culture that they felt I got wrong. And it was just, like, such a weird thing, and they were doing it on Twitter, but without naming me, and it was just so strange because they're like, "Oh, like, no one would ever use this word." And I was just like, "Yes, they would. I grew up with this word." Like, it's just odd, but, like, I think that's just what happens when, like, there's, like, true cultural exchange, there's always gonna be little hiccups.
And I mean, just like anything, as it becomes bigger and bigger, there are different point of views and different perspectives. Obviously, everybody,
Yeah.
not everybody has to share the same opinions or thoughts. But so, what do you think is next for K-pop? I mean, BTS, will they get bigger? Will Blackpink become, the female version of BTS, or do you see any other type of K-pop groups or artists that are coming up that
Mhm.
that may not duplicate the success of BTS? I
Right.
mean, that is singular, but may appeal to different types of groups of people.
Yeah, so what I think the future is so I don't think K-pop is a trend or, like, a little flash in the pan. What I think is hopefully gonna happen is there's gonna be less of a, like, distinction as much between K-pop and regular, just pop in
Music.
general, because, like, the music itself is really universal. It's just happens to be, you know, majority in a different language. But I think that's starting to matter a lot less as people get to know um, K-pop and get to know the artists themselves. It's so funny because this summer, like, like, my group of friends, they love Lady Gaga, and when Blackpink did a track on Lady Gaga's album, they knew all the Korean words, and it was just like I never would have imagined that would ever happen in a million years, and I was like, that is awesome. And with the Blackpink Netflix documentary, so many people I know watched it, like, just very curious about it, and just, like, came away with so much appreciation and respect for, everything that K-pop stars go through. And even if they don't really understand the language without subtitles, people are, like, a little more willing to read the subtitles. So I think it's going to continue. I don't think, like, K-pop should try too hard to make, like, a all English word songs or anything like that, because I think people now appreciate that the things that make K-pop K-pop. So I think it's going to continue, and I think there might be, like, more and more collaborations and breakdowns between, like, oh, this is K-pop, this is not K-pop, and just be like, hey, this is, like, maybe all of us can be a little more global in what we listen to. Um, Also, a really interesting debut recently was SM debuted a new girl group called aespa, and it really just felt like a debut of the future. It was like almost it was all to me, it was almost too futuristic. It was like everything was so glossy, everything was looked so high
Right.
tech, the choreography was so on point, and they even had, like, AI characters, each of the members. And I was just like, wow, is
Wow.
this the future? But, like, I think that's also just one group, but I think they're definitely gonna surprise us with lots of different types of things. So
And how about you? What's next for you?
So I'm currently writing the sequel to Kpop Confidential. It's due very soon. I might be a little late. And then I want to return to the book I've been working on for 10 years before I started writing Kpop Confidential. And it's already 700 pages long. It should not be 700 pages. Part of the work is making it a lot shorter. But that is all about Korean American culture. So I definitely want to get back to that.
And we can't wait to read it. And we
Oh,
can
thank you.
hopefully, when that book comes out, you can come back and tell us more about that book.
Oh, I'd love to.
Yeah, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for now. So thanks again to Stephan. Congratulations again. And
Thank
we
you.
wish you all the best and stay healthy. You can
Thank you.
purchase Kpop Confidential wherever books are sold. You can find more information about it on our website as well, koreasociety.org. Special thanks to Peter, our IT director, for making this live webcast a possibility, and to our interns, Gi and Hiju, for getting all the questions and doing email outreach and social media postings. And of course, our thanks to you, our viewers and members. We hope you'll join us again next year. Check out what's coming up on our website, koreasociety.org, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And happy reading and happy holidays. Thank you.
Bye.